Gareth Veyland, a wealthy British financier, vanished under the African stars. His wife Clarissa believed he was in Dubai, but he was secretly on safari with his beautiful mistress, Isolde Marin. Within days, Gareth was gone, his body buried. In the wilderness, his millions missing, and a ruthless mercenary named Jonas Riker hunting for answers. What began as a lover's escape turned into a deadly game of betrayal, greed, and murder that left only one question. How did Isolde manage to outsmart them all and disappear without a trace? The air was heavy with heat as Gareth Veyland stepped off his private jet in Nairobi, the kind of heat that clung to skin and left no space for comfort. Gareth was a man who never felt out of place in foreign lands. With his expensive tailored suit and gold cufflinks, he carried the look of someone who belonged wherever he chose to stand. But this trip was unlike his usual business ventures. It was not about boardrooms or contracts. This time, Gareth was chasing secrecy, adventure, and the thrill of what he believed he could keep hidden. His wife, Clarissa, thought he was in Dubai, attending a conference, a lie rehearsed with ease, woven into the fabric of his double life. She had grown used to his absences, never asking too many questions, believing he was consumed by the world of finance and negotiations. The truth was darker, and it began to take shape when Gareth met Isolde Marin. Isolde was younger, striking, and intoxicating in a way that made Gareth feel both powerful and vulnerable. She worked in the art world, dealing with rare collections, traveling from city to city and leaving trails of envy wherever she went. She was clever enough to know how to use her beauty as a weapon, and Gareth was too eager to surrender. What began as casual meetings in London turned into secret weekends abroad, and finally, a dangerous plan to escape the predictable life Gareth had built with Clarissa. It was Isolde's idea to meet in Africa, where no one could easily trace them. She insisted the safari would be the perfect cover, a place of freedom where promises of wealth and love could be spoken without fear. When they arrived at the lodge, it was as though they had stepped into another world. Wooden decks stretched out toward endless plains of golden grass. Elephants wandered in the distance like shadows of giants. The sunsets painted the sky in flames of orange and red, a view that promised beauty and danger in equal measure. To the staff, Gareth and Isolde introduced themselves under different names, playing the part of a wealthy couple looking for privacy. No one questioned them. In such places, guests were often eager to erase their pasts, if only for a short while. But what the staff did notice was the way Isolde's eyes scanned every detail, how she seemed less interested in the animals and more in the movements of the people around her. Gareth, on the other hand, tried to bury his anxieties beneath laughter and fine wine. He had recently moved large sums of money out of accounts connected to his company. Quiet transfers had been made through offshore channels, enough to raise suspicion among his associates. Rumors followed him, whispering that he was not just a financier, but also a man willing to gamble with illegal deals. The safari trip was his escape, a chance to disappear from questions that were closing in back home. He told Isolde that this was the start of something permanent. He dreamed aloud about leaving Clarissa, starting a new life far from London, and pouring his fortune into a future built only for them. But beneath his confidence lay cracks he could not hide. At night, while Isolde lounged on the terrace sipping champagne, Gareth sat with his phone pressed tightly to his ear, answering calls that seemed to unsettle him. His tone grew sharp, his words hurried, and though he pretended nothing was wrong, his eyes betrayed the truth. Each time he returned to her side, he masked his unease with a smile that never reached his eyes. Isolde noticed, though she did not question him, she preferred silence, knowing that sooner or later the truth would show itself. By the third evening, the air at the lodge felt heavier, as though carrying a warning neither of them could read. The sounds of the savannah filled the night, distant, roars of lions mixing with the restless chirping of insects. Gareth walked to the balcony, looking out into the vast darkness, and whispered words only the night could hear. He was not running toward freedom, though he wanted to believe it. He was running from enemies who had already begun to close the circle around him. The safari, meant to be a secret paradise, was quietly becoming the stage for a deadly game. Isolde leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile on her lips, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. The third night began with the kind of silence that unsettled even the most seasoned travelers. The Masai Mara stretched endlessly in the dark, broken only by the glow of lanterns flickering across the wooden decks of the lodge. Gareth had spent the day restless, pacing the floor of the suite, speaking in hushed tones on his phone and glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be listening. Isolde had grown tired of his paranoia, yet she kept her observations to herself, sipping wine and studying him with eyes that revealed nothing. When his phone rang again, just after dinner, Gareth's expression hardened. He excused himself abruptly, grabbed the keys to a waiting jeep, and disappeared into the night with Ezekiel Muto, the guide assigned to them since their arrival. To the staff, it seemed unusual for a guest to leave so late, but no one dared to intervene. Gareth was the type of man who demanded obedience without words. Hours passed. The warm African night hummed with the chorus of insects and the low growls of predators moving through the grass. Inside the lodge, most guests had retired, but Isolde remained awake. She leaned on the railing of the balcony, staring out into the wilderness. To anyone watching, her composure appeared unnerving. She showed no sign of worry, no anxious pacing or nervous calls to the staff. Instead, she seemed almost expectant, as though she knew precisely what was unfolding beyond the darkness. At around 3 a.m, commotion broke the stillness. A figure stumbled toward the lodge, covered in dirt and streaks of blood. It was Ezekiel. His clothes were torn, and his face carried the look of a man who had narrowly escaped death. Collapsing at the entrance, he shouted that they had been ambushed. Staff rushed to lift him, their voices rising in panic as he struggled to explain. According to Ezekiel, masked men had appeared from the bush, armed and ruthless. They spoke in Swahili and English, demanding Gareth by name. The guide claimed he tried to shield him, but Gareth was dragged from the jeep and beaten before being forced into the shadows. Gunfire erupted, and Ezekiel fled in terror, narrowly escaping with wounds to his arm and leg. Word spread quickly through the lodge. Some guests screamed, others locked themselves in their rooms. The management called local authorities, who promised helicopters at dawn. Rangers were dispatched into the bush with torches, searching for any sign of Gareth. Yet despite the chaos, Isolde remained unusually calm. She neither wept nor screamed, choosing instead to sit alone at a table with her glass of wine still in hand. The staff whispered among themselves, unsettled by her strange composure. They expected panic, or at least fear, but instead she radiated detachment, her eyes fixed on nothing. When police arrived, they questioned her carefully. She admitted Gareth had left suddenly, but claimed to know nothing of where he was going or why. Her answers were clipped and precise, lacking the emotional weight one would expect from someone whose lover had just been taken violently into the night. Some investigators suspected shock, others wondered if she was withholding the truth. Clarissa Veyland, Gareth's wife, was contacted back in London and told of the disappearance. Shocked and furious, she prepared to fly to Kenya, unaware that the nightmare waiting for her was far greater than she could imagine. As daylight broke over the savannah, search teams found the abandoned jeep. The windshield was shattered and blood stained the seat where Gareth had sat. A phone lay discarded on the ground, its screen cracked, the last call unanswered. The sand around the vehicle was disturbed with heavy boot prints, clear evidence of a struggle. Yet no body was found, no trail of blood leading away. It was as though Gareth had been swallowed by the wilderness itself. Rumours grew with each passing hour. Some believed he had been kidnapped by local bandits hoping for ransom. Others whispered of enemies from abroad who had followed him into the heart of Africa. Among the lodge staff, however, a darker suspicion spread, that Isolde knew more than she let on. The way she had carried herself that night, calm while others panicked, left them uneasy. She appeared less like a victim and more like someone watching a plan unfold. By the time Clarissa boarded her flight to Nairobi, the story was already making headlines in London. A wealthy financier missing on safari, a mistress caught in the middle, and whispers of millions moved across borders. What had begun as a romantic escape was already transforming into an international scandal. And as the sun sank once again over the plains, Gareth's fate remained hidden, buried in the silence of the African night. When Clarissa Veyland arrived in Nairobi, she carried herself with the composure of a woman used to controlling her surroundings. Tall, polished, and accustomed to commanding attention, she stepped off the plane into a storm of cameras and reporters, already circling the story. Her husband's disappearance was international news, and the press wasted no time branding it as a scandal. The world quickly learned that Gareth had not been travelling alone. The presence of Isolde Marin, the mistress, turned the disappearance into a headline dripping with betrayal and intrigue. By the time Clarissa reached the lodge in the Masai Mara, she was already seething with humiliation and suspicion. The reunion between wife and mistress was anything but ordinary. Clarissa expected to find a woman consumed by grief, but instead, she found Isolde seated comfortably on the terrace, dressed immaculately, her expression detached. To Clarissa, this was proof of arrogance, a silent insult to her dignity. Yet Isolde showed no sign of discomfort under the scrutiny. When investigators asked her to recount the events, she delivered her answers with cold precision, explaining that Gareth had left late at night, taken by masked men, while she remained at the lodge. Her words were careful, stripped of emotion, as though she were reciting lines rehearsed long before. The detectives turned their focus to Gareth's background. Within days, a troubling picture emerged. Bank records revealed suspicious transfers in the weeks before the trip. Millions had been quietly moved from company accounts into offshore holdings, some linked to wildlife charities that appeared to exist only on paper. Other transfers led to art dealers known for handling forgeries. It became clear Gareth was not just a financier with a wandering heart. He was a man entangled in layers of deceit. His disappearance was beginning to look less like a random kidnapping and more like the result of carefully laid consequences. For Clarissa, the discoveries cut deeper than betrayal. She realized her husband had been living a double life, not only with another woman, but also with money that did not belong to him. The empire she believed was stable now looked fragile, built on lies and dangerous associations. She demanded answers, confronting Isolde in front of the investigators. Isolde, however, did not flinch. She claimed Gareth had promised her freedom, a life together far from London, fueled by the millions he secretly pulled from his accounts. To her, Clarissa was the one who had been deceived, left with nothing while Gareth attempted to reinvent himself with another woman. Investigators pressed. Ezekiel, the guide, who was still recovering from his injuries, his story of the ambush remained the same, though doubts grew. Some believed he was too frightened to tell the full truth. Others suspected he had been coerced. Still, his details about the masked men were consistent. They had known Gareth's name, spoken both Swahili and English, and acted with a precision that suggested planning rather than chance. The half-burnt ledger found in the jeep added another layer of intrigue. It contained names, numbers, and coded transactions that pointed to dealings far beyond the world of finance. Specialists concluded it was evidence of money laundering, mixed with illegal sales of art and possibly even weapons. Despite the evidence, no ransom note ever arrived. There were no demands, no calls from supposed kidnappers, and no trail leading toward negotiations. This silence unsettled the authorities. In genuine kidnappings, communication was key. In Gareth's case, there was nothing but absence. The conclusion many began to reach was grim. Gareth had not been taken for ransom. He had been silenced. Clarissa struggled with the reality pressing in on her. She had lost a husband to lies, to another woman, and possibly to murder. She stayed at the lodge, restless and sleepless, while Isolde seemed unshaken. Guests at the lodge whispered about the two women, one grieving and furious, the other eerily calm. Some speculated that Isolde's composure meant she knew Gareth was never coming back. By the end of the week, the investigation had shifted from a missing person case to a homicide inquiry. The search teams scaled back, the helicopters left the skies, and the Kenyan police focused on tracking the money Gareth had moved. To Clarissa's dismay, she learned that most of her husband's fortune was gone, siphoned into shell companies and accounts she could not access. The future she thought was secure had vanished with him. The scandal deepened as the media painted Clarissa as the betrayed wife and Isolde as the mysterious mistress tied to Gareth's vanishing fortune. But beneath the sensational headlines, investigators were quietly piecing together a far more dangerous truth, one that linked Gareth's disappearance not only to love and betrayal, but to the shadows of organized crime. The safari trip, sold to Clarissa as a business conference, was revealed as something far more sinister, a gamble that had cost Gareth Veyland everything. The investigators working the case were no longer chasing the hope of finding Gareth alive. Their focus had shifted to unraveling the tangled web of his associations, and every thread led them deeper into a network of secrets he had kept hidden, even from those closest to him. Bank records, phone logs, and fragments of correspondence uncovered a disturbing connection. Gareth had not only been moving money through offshore accounts and fake charities, he had also been linked to a figure who was already known to law enforcement agencies across Europe: Jonas Riker. Jonas was a name spoken in low tones among investigators, who tracked international crime. A Norwegian mercenary with a reputation for ruthlessness, he had carved a fortune for himself by selling services no government could openly admit to hiring. He specialized in private hunts, not of wildlife, but of people, bounty contracts that blurred the line between assassination and revenge. For years, he had evaded prosecution by hiding behind shell companies and disposable identities, always vanishing before the authorities could catch up. Now, evidence suggested Gareth had once been his partner in a deal involving smuggled weapons, disguised as art shipments. That deal had gone sour, leaving Jonas with losses he never forgave. The safari trip began to take on new meaning. Far from being a coincidence, investigators realized it was the perfect setting for payback. Remote, unmonitored, and far from the eyes of European agencies, the Kenyan plains offered Jonas the stage for a reckoning. But suspicion did not stop at Jonas. Records showed Isolde had been in communication with him for months, leading up to the trip. Encrypted messages traced through hidden servers revealed a relationship built not on love, but on calculated plotting. She had promised him access to Gareth, positioning herself as both accomplice and bait. The affair that Clarissa had viewed as betrayal was, in reality, part of something even darker, a trap carefully arranged. Ezekiel's confession was the turning point. Pressured by investigators, he admitted he had been paid to lead Gareth into the ambush. The masked men, he explained, were not local bandits at all, but Jonas's operatives, flown into the country under false pretenses. Ezekiel insisted he had not known the plan would end in death. He thought it was only meant to frighten Gareth into handing over information or money. But once the gunfire started, he realized he had been used. His injuries, once seen as proof of survival, were self-inflicted wounds meant to cover his role. Terrified of Jonas and fearful of prison, Ezekiel pointed to Isolde as the true architect of the scheme. The story she had told the authorities unraveled quickly. Investigators learned she had pushed Gareth to make the trip, arranging details of the lodge and persuading him that it was the perfect place to talk about their future. She had convinced him to move the money in advance, assuring him it was a necessary step for their escape together. The timing was no accident. Once the transfers were made, she contacted Jonas, giving him the opportunity he had been waiting for. The ambush in the bush was not random, but the final step in a carefully choreographed betrayal. But betrayal has its own rules. Jonas soon discovered Isolde had double-crossed him. The millions Gareth moved were funneled into shell companies that only she controlled. When Jonas's men tried to access the funds, they found the trail cut off, blocked by layers of fraudulent accounts designed to keep him out. She had dangled the promise of wealth to secure his cooperation, only to vanish with everything once Gareth was eliminated. The mercenary who had hunted countless men across continents now realized he had been manipulated. Investigators piecing the case together saw the shape of a plan that revealed Isolde's true nature. She was not simply a mistress caught in scandal, but a strategist who had played both Gareth and Jonas for her own gain. While Gareth had believed he was running toward freedom and Jonas had believed he was exacting revenge, both men were pawns in her design. The more evidence surfaced, the clearer it became that she had anticipated every move, from Gareth's secrecy to Jonas's hunger for retribution. As the truth emerged, a sense of dread grew among those pursuing her. She was no longer in Kenya, and her trail was faint, suggesting she had prepared for this escape long before the first steps of the plan were set in motion. For Gareth, the safari had been a dream of love and freedom. For Jonas, it was meant to be justice for betrayal. For Isolde, it was neither. It was the perfect stage for a deception that left one man buried and another consumed with rage, while she disappeared into the shadows with millions. The discovery of Gareth Veyland's remains came weeks after the night of the ambush, when a team of rangers, following a faint trail near the Tanzanian border, stumbled across a shallow grave. The soil was loose, the burial hurried, and the evidence chilling. A single bullet wound to the skull confirmed what investigators already suspected. Gareth had not been taken for ransom. He had been executed. The news spread quickly, both in Kenya and abroad, cementing the story as one of betrayal and greed rather than tragedy. For Clarissa Veyland, the confirmation was devastating, but the grief was complicated by anger. She had lost a husband, but also the life she thought she understood. He had betrayed her with another woman, with stolen money, and with a secret double life that unraveled in the harshest way possible. Authorities wasted no time in rounding up those they could reach. Ezekiel Muto was arrested first, his confession and injuries already exposing him as a willing participant. He admitted again to leading Gareth into the trap, but insisted that the murder was not part of his agreement. In his version, he was a guide caught between fear and survival, lured by money he could not refuse. His cooperation bought him some protection, but it also placed the weight of responsibility on Jonas Riker. When investigators finally closed in on Jonas, he was tracked to a safe house near Mombasa, where forged documents, weapons, and satellite phones were recovered. Under interrogation, Jonas offered little but contempt. He admitted to organizing the ambush, acknowledged his hatred for Gareth, but placed the blame squarely on Isolde Maren. According to him, she had orchestrated everything and then vanished, before he could claim what was owed to him. Interpol soon joined the case, issuing a warrant for Isolde that spread across borders, but her trail was cold. Surveillance footage showed her leaving Nairobi shortly after Gareth's disappearance, dressed simply, carrying little luggage, and moving with an ease that suggested preparation. From there, she seemed to dissolve into the world, slipping through airports, changing names, and accessing accounts hidden beyond the reach of the authorities. The millions Gareth had transferred were gone, buried in a labyrinth of offshore entities that investigators could not untangle. To those who had studied her carefully, it was clear she had been planning her escape long before the trip began. Clarissa returned to London with what little was left of her husband's estate. Most of his wealth had disappeared into the hands of his mistress, and creditors circled what remained. The woman who once appeared the picture of privilege was now left with scandal, whispers, and the wreckage of a life she thought was secure. For her, the safari was not just the end of her marriage, but the exposure of everything Gareth had kept hidden. The home she returned to was filled with ghosts, and every glance from society was a reminder of the betrayal she could never erase. The case gained notoriety in Europe, labelled in newspapers as the Safari Mistress murder. It was told as a story of lust, greed, and betrayal against the backdrop of the African wilderness. Yet behind the sensational headlines, the investigation left more questions than answers. Why had Gareth truly been moving such large sums of money? What deeper ties bound him to Jonas? And how far back had Isolde been planning the betrayal that ended with Gareth's execution? Authorities suspected she had allies beyond what was, known figures who had helped her vanish, but proof remained elusive. For Jonas, prison became the inevitable outcome. His reputation as a mercenary was shattered when the betrayal by Isolde became public. The man feared for orchestrating hunts across continents was reduced to a captive, raging against a woman who had outplayed him. Ezekiel's fate was sealed. As well, sentenced for his role in the ambush, though many believed he had been nothing more than a pawn. Isolde Maren, however, became a phantom. Sightings were reported in Argentina, then Brazil, later in Spain, but none confirmed. Some believed she had undergone surgery to alter her appearance. Others whispered she had found protection with powerful figures who valued her cunning. Wherever she was, she lived on stolen millions, the architect of a plan that destroyed everyone around her. Gareth lay in a shallow grave, Jonas rotted in prison, Ezekiel faded into obscurity, and Clarissa was left to rebuild her shattered life. Isolde alone escaped, her name etched into history as the woman who turned a lover's promise into a weapon and walked away untouched. The safari, once imagined as a place of freedom, became instead a stage for betrayal that echoed across continents. It was a story of how love, greed, and power collide, and how the pursuit of millions can twist even the most intimate bond into something lethal. The mystery that lingers is not what happened to Gareth Veyland, whose fate is known, but what became of Isolde Maren, the mistress who vanished into the shadows with blood on her hands and fortune in her grasp.